April 13, 1972. An Loc, South Vietnam. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Cong Vinh pressed his back against the rubble of what used to be a two-story administrative building. The morning air tasted of cordite and burning rubber. Around him, the city was dying in slow motion. Buildings reduced to skeletal frames, streets cratered into moonscapes, civilians huddled in whatever holes offered shelter from the artillery that had been falling for 6 days straight. Through the dust and smoke, Vinh watched the T-54 tanks roll down Highway 13. Soviet-made, brand new, their 100mm main guns traversing lazily as they searched for targets. Behind them came the infantry, wave after wave of North Vietnamese regulars in pith helmets and khaki uniforms, not guerrillas in black pajamas, not the Viet Cong his men had fought for years. This was the People's Army of Vietnam, equipped like a real military, fighting like one too. Vinh checked his M16, then looked at the faces of the ARVN soldiers around him. Young, terrified, poorly supplied. The Americans had promised air support, but the weather was shit and the clouds hung low like a shroud. His radio crackled with desperate calls from other units. The 5th ARVN Division was fragmenting under the assault. Provincial officials were already fleeing south. A sergeant appeared at his elbow. "Sir, regiment wants to know if we're pulling back." Vinh thought about the 15,000 civilians still trapped in An Loc. He thought about the road south, Highway 13, now called Thunder Road, because of all the ambushes. He thought about what Hanoi's propaganda would say if this city fell just as the Americans were leaving. "Tell them we hold," Vinh said. "We hold or we die here." He didn't know it yet, but he just committed to one of the most desperate defensive stands in military history. For the next 66 days, An Loc would become a name that meant something. Proof that South Vietnamese forces could fight, could bleed, could refuse to break, even when the world had written them off as already defeated. The tanks kept coming. In Hanoi, the generals were smiling. General Von Nguyen Giap and his staff had watched the Americans leave with the satisfaction of men who'd simply waited out an empire. By early 1972, U.S. troop strength in South Vietnam had dropped from over 500,000 to just 95,000. Nixon's Vietnamization policy meant the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, would have to stand alone. And in Hanoi's assessment, the ARVN couldn't stand at all. "The puppet army will collapse like a house of cards," one North Vietnamese political officer wrote in March 1972. Hanoi had reason for confidence. They'd spent 3 years building up forces in Cambodia and Laos, stockpiling Soviet weapons, training divisions in conventional warfare. The 1972 Easter Offensive, officially called the Nguyen Hue Campaign, would be the largest military operation since 1968. Over 200,000 troops, hundreds of tanks, long-range artillery, surface-to-air missiles to counter American air power. The target list was ambitious. Quang Tri in the north, Con Tum in the central highlands, and An Loc, a provincial capital just 65 miles north of Saigon. Take An Loc, and you had a straight shot down Highway 13 to the South Vietnamese capital. The city sat at the junction of critical supply routes. Its fall would be both strategically vital and symbolically devastating. "We believed we would take An Loc in 2 weeks," Lieutenant Colonel Hoang Dinh Tho of the 5th VC Division later recalled. "Our intelligence said the ARVN 5th Division there was weak, poorly led. Their morale was broken. We had 3 divisions, tanks, artillery. It would be over quickly." In Washington and Saigon, the pessimism was just as thick. Vietnamization was Nixon's exit strategy. But nobody, not in the Pentagon, not in the CIA, not in the State Department, truly believed the South Vietnamese military could survive a major conventional assault without massive American ground support. The ARVN is brave, but poorly led at the senior levels, one CIA assessment noted in early 1972. Given the withdrawal of U.S. advisors from forward positions and the reduction in American firepower, it is questionable whether ARVN forces can withstand a determined multi-division assault by NVA regulars. American military advisors who'd worked with the 5th ARVN Division painted an even bleaker picture. The division had been mauled in Cambodia in 1970 and 1971. Its commanders were political appointees more interested in Saigon social circles than battlefield tactics. Corruption was endemic. Desertion rates were climbing. When Lieutenant Colonel Bill Miller, the senior American advisor in Bin Long Province, assessed An Loc's defenses in March 1972, he found a garrison of about 2,500 ARVN troops, scattered provincial forces, some territorial militia, and not nearly enough ammunition. "If the NVA hits this place with everything they've got," Miller told his staff, "I give us a week, maybe less." The South Vietnamese High Command wasn't much more optimistic. President Nguyen Van Thieu had bigger problems. Quang Tri was already under assault, and there were only so many reserves to go around. An Loc was important, yes, but if push came to shove, losing a provincial capital 65 miles from Saigon was preferable to losing the northern provinces entirely. Both sides were about to be proven wrong in ways that would define the final years of the war. An Loc had never been quiet. The city, really more of a large town, had spent years as a backwater provincial capital in Bin Long Province, surrounded by rubber plantations and triple canopy jungle. It had been attacked before. The Viet Cong tried to overrun it during the Tet Offensive in 1968 and failed. But by 1972, everything had changed. The Paris peace talks were dragging on, with Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho dancing around the same issues year after year. Nixon needed Vietnamization to work, needed the South Vietnamese to prove they could defend themselves, so he could declare victory and go home. Hanoi knew this, and Hanoi knew that if they could shatter the ARVN's credibility with a major offensive victory, they could force favorable peace terms or simply collapse the South entirely. The Easter Offensive launched on March 30, 1972, across multiple fronts simultaneously. In the north, 3 NVA divisions smashed across the DMZ with tank-led assaults. In the Central Highlands, another 2 divisions attacked Kontum. And in the south, the 5th, 7th, and 9th VC divisions, all actually NVA regulars by this point, began converging on An Loc from Cambodia. The force arrayed against An Loc was staggering. Approximately 36,000 troops supported by T-54 and PT-76 tanks, 130mm artillery, 122mm rockets, and anti-aircraft weapons. The plan was textbook Soviet combined arms doctrine. Use artillery to pulverize defenses, tanks to break through, infantry to exploit. 3 divisions attacking a city defended by 1 understrength ARVN division. The math seemed simple. What the North Vietnamese didn't fully account for was the small city's geography and the character of the men inside it. An Loc sat in a roughly rectangular area, maybe 2 kilometers by 1 kilometer. Dense urban terrain, buildings, narrow streets, rubble that would become obstacles for armor. And the defenders, while outnumbered, had something Hanoi miscalculated. American advisors on the ground calling in American air power from above. The siege began in earnest on April 7, 1972, when the first major artillery barrage hit the city. Over the next 6 days, more than 7,000 shells and rockets slammed into An Loc. The bombardment was designed to soften up defenses before the ground assault. Instead, it gave the defenders time to prepare, dig in, and realize they were in for the fight of their lives. By April 12th, the NVA had cut Highway 13 south of the city, isolating An Loc completely. No supplies in by road, no reinforcements, no escape. The only lifeline was the sky, C-130 transports that would have to fly through intense anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies by parachute. Lieutenant Colonel Miller, the American advisor, consolidated what forces he had. The 5th ARVN Division's 7th Regiment was the core defense. They were joined by elements of the 8th Regiment, some territorial forces, and hundreds of civilians who picked up weapons when their homes were destroyed. Total strength, maybe 5,000 fighters against 36,000 attackers. We knew we couldn't hold forever, recalled Sergeant First Class Billy Joe Doyle, an American advisor. But we figured if we made them bleed enough, made it cost too much, maybe they'd give up. That was the plan. Make it hurt so bad they quit. The NVA had no intention of quitting, and Loc was too valuable. Its fall would open the road to Saigon and humiliate Nixon's Vietnamization strategy. On April 13th, the ground assault began. The first wave hit at dawn. 12 T-54 tanks rolled down Highway 13 into the northern sector of An Loc, engines roaring, machine guns chattering. Behind them came the infantry, hundreds of NVA regulars in textbook assault formation. The plan was to punch through the northern defenses, penetrate into the city center, and break the ARVN's will to resist. Captain Tron Van Nut of the ARVN 8th Regiment watched them come from a bunker near the northern perimeter. He had exactly 4 M72 Law rockets, light anti-tank weapons, and about 30 men. The American advisor with his unit, Major Walter Ulmer, was on the radio screaming for air support. "First tank is at 200 meters, Nutt said calmly in broken English, then 150, then 100. At 75 meters, he fired. The Law rocket streaked out, hit the lead T-54 on the turret ring, and the tank lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. The second tank tried to maneuver around it. Another Law hit the treads, then a third. Within minutes, 3 tanks were burning in the street, blocking the advance. The infantry kept coming. Nutt's men opened up with everything they had: M16s, M60 machine guns, grenades. The NVA troops went to ground, taking cover behind rubble. The assault stalled. Then the sky opened up. 2 A-37 Dragonflies screamed overhead, dropping napalm on the NVA positions. The street erupted in flame. Behind them came F-4 Phantoms with 500-pound bombs and cluster munitions. Then AC-130 Spectre gunships circling overhead like birds of prey, their side-firing 20mm cannons and 40mm Bofors guns turning the jungle approaches into killing fields. Air power saved us that first day, Major Ulmer later said. Without it, we would have been overrun in hours. But the NVA kept coming, wave after wave. Over the next 3 days, the North Vietnamese launched repeated assaults from the north and west. Each time the pattern was similar: artillery preparation, tank-led assault, ARVN defenders fighting from rubble and bunkers, American air power arriving just in time to break the attack. The city became a charnel house. Bodies in the streets, buildings collapsing, civilians trapped in basements with no water and dwindling food. On April 15th, the NVA changed tactics. Instead of frontal assaults, they began infiltrating small units into the city at night, trying to establish strong points inside the defensive perimeter. This turned An Loc into a 3-dimensional nightmare, fighting in basements, on rooftops, in bombed-out buildings where you couldn't tell friend from enemy until it was too late. Sergeant Tran Quoc Din recalled clearing a building room by room. We found NVA soldiers in every floor, some dead from bombs, some waiting to ambush us. We threw grenades into every room before entering. The whole building shook. When we got to the top floor, there were 3 enemy soldiers, badly wounded. They asked for water. We had none to give them. The most desperate moment came on April 19th. The NVA launched a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously: north, west, and east. They committed tanks and infantry in battalion strength, backed by the heaviest artillery barrage yet. Over 1,000 shells hit the city in 2 hours. The command post took a direct hit, killing several staff officers. Communications were cut. Smoke was so thick you couldn't see 50 meters. Lieutenant Colonel Miller found himself directing the defense from a bunker with no working radio, sending runners through streets swept by machine gun fire. ARVN units were isolated, each fighting its own private war. In the northern sector, Captain Nutt's company was surrounded, down to 15 men and almost out of ammunition. And then Major Nguyen Thanh Tri, commanding the ARVN 81st Airborne Ranger Group that had been dropped into the city days earlier, did something crazy. He gathered every man he could find, rangers, stragglers, even wounded soldiers who could still shoot, and launched a counterattack right into the teeth of the NVA assault. We had to retake the northern strongpoints, or we were finished, Tree later explained. So we attacked. No planning, no support. Just attacking because defense was failing. They went forward with bayonets fixed, firing from the hip, throwing grenades into bunkers, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. The shock of seeing defenders suddenly attacking in the middle of their own siege stunned the NVA troops. They fell back. The line held. By nightfall on April 19th, both sides were exhausted. The NVA had taken catastrophic casualties, hundreds dead, tanks destroyed, assault units shattered. But An Loc was still holding. Barely. The siege settled into a brutal routine. Every morning, the artillery would start. Sometimes 500 shells, sometimes 2,000. The NVA had moved their 130mm guns closer, and now they could hit anywhere in the city with devastating accuracy. The defenders learned to live underground, emerging only to fight. Bunkers became home. The smell of death, decomposing bodies that couldn't be recovered, became part of the air you breathed. The North Vietnamese adapted their tactics daily. After losing so many tanks in frontal assaults, they began using them as mobile artillery platforms, firing from standoff distances instead of charging into the streets. They intensified night infiltration, sending sappers with satchel charges to blow up key positions. They dug trenches closer and closer to the perimeter, advancing their lines a few meters each night. Most critically, they improved their anti-aircraft defenses. The American air support that had saved An Loc repeatedly now faced a gauntlet of 23mm, 37mm, and 57mm anti-aircraft guns, plus SA-7 shoulder-fired missiles. C-130s trying to drop supplies had to fly through walls of flak. Many were hit. Some went down. It got to the point where we had to drop from 10,000 feet, recalled Air Force Major Colin Clark, who flew supply missions. At that altitude, with the winds, maybe half our supplies landed inside the perimeter. The rest fell into enemy hands. We watched the NVA wave at us while they picked up our ammunition. The defenders adapted too. ARVN soldiers became expert at urban warfare, something they'd previously been terrible at. They learned to use rubble for cover, to move through buildings instead of streets, to set up interlocking fields of fire. They salvaged weapons from destroyed tanks. They made every bullet count because resupply was never guaranteed. The Rangers and paratroopers, elite units, became the fire brigade, rushing to wherever the line was breaking. Colonel Tran Van Nut's Rangers held the northern sector with fanatical determination, launching small unit counterattacks that kept the NVA off balance. Captain Lee Van Mee's paratroopers did the same in the west. The American advisors were crucial. They couldn't fight directly in large numbers. There were only a few dozen of them. But they controlled the air support. Every day, Major Miller and his team called in dozens of strikes. Tactical air support, B-52 Arc Light missions that dropped hundreds of tons of bombs on NVA staging areas, helicopter gunships that worked the tree lines. The advisors were incredible, an ARVN lieutenant said years later. They stayed with us. They could have been evacuated. Some were wounded multiple times but refused to leave. They shared our food, our danger, our holes in the ground. That meant something. The civilians trapped in An Loc endured their own hell. Some 10,000 remained in the city, hiding in basements and bunkers. Food and water were critically short. Medical supplies were almost gone. The wounded lay in overcrowded aid stations, sometimes 3 to a stretcher, with barely enough morphine to dull the pain. Medevac helicopters tried to evacuate the worst cases, but the landing zones were under constant fire. Yet somehow, morale held. Perhaps it was because the alternative, surrender or retreat, meant certain death. Perhaps it was because the ARVN soldiers, so often derided by Americans as incompetent, were finally proving they could fight. Or perhaps it was simply exhaustion so profound that you stopped caring about anything except surviving the next hour. By early May, the siege had lasted nearly a month. The NVA had failed to break the defense, but they hadn't given up. In Hanoi, the decision was made to commit even more forces. If An Loc fell now, after so much blood, it would still be worth it. If it didn't fall, the political cost would be catastrophic. The final, desperate assaults were about to begin. May 11, 1972. The curtain rose on hell. The North Vietnamese committed everything to one final push. 25,000 troops, every operational tank, every artillery piece. The plan was to overwhelm the defenders through sheer mass, attack from all sides simultaneously, breach the perimeter in multiple places, flood into the city, and finish it in close combat where American air power couldn't intervene. The bombardment that morning was the worst of the siege. Over 7,000 shells hit An Loc in 6 hours. Entire blocks that had somehow survived were reduced to smoking craters. The command post was hit again. The hospital took direct hits, killing doctors and wounded alike. Radio antennas were blown down. Buildings collapsed on defenders in their bunkers. When the barrage lifted, the assault came from everywhere at once. In the north, NVA infantry rushed forward behind a creeping barrage, overrunning the first line of trenches. In the west, tanks broke through the perimeter wire and penetrated 100 meters into the city, before being stopped by law rockets. In the east, sappers blew holes in the defensive wall and assault troops poured through. In the south, diversionary attacks kept reserves pinned down. For 6 hours, the battle raged in chaos. Small units fought isolated actions. The Rangers counterattacked in the north. The paratroopers held the western sector by their fingernails. ARVN soldiers fired until their weapons melted, then picked up enemy AKs and kept fighting. And the American air power came in waves. A-37s, F-4s, AC-130s, even B-52s bombing danger close, so close that ARVN troops felt the concussion and had to take cover from their own side's bombs. The aviators flew through hell itself. Surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft fire so thick it looked like a curtain of steel. Several aircraft were hit. Some limped home, some didn't. Captain Tran Van Nut was killed leading a counterattack in the northern sector, shot through the chest while throwing a grenade. Major Tri was wounded for the second time, but refused evacuation, commanding from a stretcher. Sergeant Doyle, the American advisor, was blown off his feet by a rocket blast, his uniform shredded, but kept calling in airstrikes with blood running down his face. By late afternoon, the assault was breaking. The NVA had penetrated the perimeter in several places, but they couldn't exploit. Every time they massed for a breakthrough, air power found them. The close quarters fighting in the rubble negated their numerical advantage. And the defenders, pushed to their absolute limit, refused to run. We had nowhere to go, one ARVN sergeant said simply. So we fought. That night, the NVA pulled back. They'd lost over 2,000 men in a single day, Dozens of tanks destroyed, entire battalions shattered, and An Loc was still holding. Over the next few days, the attacks continued, but with decreasing intensity. The North Vietnamese were exhausted too, their logistics strained, their casualties mounting. They'd expected a 2-week operation. It had been 66 days. They'd lost perhaps 10,000 killed and many more wounded. They'd committed 3 divisions and accomplished nothing. On June 18th, ARVN reinforcements finally broke through from the south, linking up with the battered defenders. The siege was effectively over. The NVA began withdrawing into Cambodia, leaving behind their dead and wrecked equipment. An Loc had held. The cost was staggering. The 5th ARVN Division had lost over 2,300 killed and wounded. The city was 90% destroyed. Hundreds of civilians had died. But the defense had worked. Against all expectations, the South Vietnamese had stood and fought and refused to break. "We proved something," Lieutenant Colonel Miller said after the battle. That Vietnamization wasn't just a slogan, that ARVN troops could fight and win against a major conventional assault. But nobody wants to talk about that. Doesn't fit the narrative. An Loc changed nothing, and everything. Strategically, the Easter offensive failed. Quang Tri eventually fell, but was retaken. Con Tum held, and Loc held. The South Vietnamese military, written off by so many, had fought the North Vietnamese army to a standstill. Vietnamization, at least militarily, seemed to work. But politically, nothing had changed. The war was still unwinnable in any meaningful sense. The Americans were still leaving. And without American air power, without those B-52s and F-4s and AC-130s, everyone knew the ARVN couldn't survive the next major offensive. And Loc proved they could fight. It didn't prove they could win. "We held because of American air support," one ARVN colonel admitted years later. When that ended in 1973, we knew. We all knew. 3 years after An Loc, in spring 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The siege had been a tactical victory and a strategic irrelevance. A footnote to a war already lost, a moment of courage in a narrative of defeat. Yet for the men who were there, An Loc meant everything. It meant that when the world expected them to fold, they stood. It meant that South Vietnamese soldiers, so often portrayed as cowards or incompetents, could look at themselves and know they'd measured up. The Rangers, paratroopers, and line troops of the 5th Division had written their names in blood and fire, and for 66 days, they'd made that blood mean something. Colonel Tran Van Nut, who fell defending the northern sector, received the highest military honor. So did dozens of others. The American advisors who stayed, Miller, Ulmer, Doyle, were decorated for valor. The aviators who flew through impossible fire received medals that couldn't capture the reality of those missions. And Loc's lesson was this: courage and competence matter, but they're not always enough. Sometimes you can fight brilliantly, sacrifice everything, prove all the doubters wrong, and still lose the war. Sometimes the victory is just surviving to fight another day, even when you know there won't be many days left. The ruins of An Loc still stand in what's now Vietnam. The trenches and bunkers are gone, the bullet holes have been filled. But the memory persists, of a city that refused to fall, of soldiers who refused to run, of 66 days when everything was on the line, and the line held. Against all odds, against all expectations, until it didn't matter anymore.